While the world was busy watching Ukraine, the G20, Trump, something quietly shifted in West Africa. Guinea Bissau's military carried out a takeover, but the statement they issued sounds almost polite, presidential even. They talked about dialogue, constitutional order, and national reconciliation. Here is what they left out of that statement, and trust me, what's missing tells you everything you need to know about why ECOWAS is scrambling. Right now, we are watching the entire architecture of West African governance come apart at the seams, and the clock is ticking. Let me show you what everyone is missing. Now, here is what happened, at least on the surface. November 25th, early morning, President Umaro Sissoco Embaló wakes up to find his residence surrounded by armed soldiers. Not rebels, not foreign mercenaries, his own presidential guard. They issued a communique. Now, that is military speak for we are taking over, but we are going to sound civilized about it. The statement suspends the constitution, dissolves governments, closes the borders. Standard playbook, right? But then it gets even weird. The military immediately announces they are forming a national council for reconciliation and democracy. They promise to organize inclusive dialogue within 30 days. They say they want to restore constitutional order. Now, I don't know about you, but when someone suspends the constitution and then promises to restore constitutional order, I start asking questions. And here is the first question that should be running through your mind. Why now? Because Embaló isn't some newcomer. He's been president since 2020. He has survived multiple military takeover attempts. We are talking 4 or 5, depending how you count. This man has more plot armor than a TV protagonist. So what changed? To understand that, we need to talk about what Guinea Bissau actually is, not the version you see in the news, the real version. Now, there is a phrase that gets whispered in West African democratic circles. You won't see it in UN official reports, but everyone knows it. Guinea Bissau is a narco-state. Now, I know that sounds dramatic, but let me give you the numbers. This is where it gets really interesting. According to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, Guinea Bissau serves as a major transshipment point for cocaine movement moving from Latin America to Europe. We are talking tons of cocaine flowing through this country every single year. Now, the route is simple. Colombian cartels ship cocaine across the Atlantic. It lands on Guinea-Bissau's coastline. Hundreds of islands, minimal coast guards, zero enforcement. From there, it moves north through the Sahel into Europe. And here is the part that matters. The drug trade in Guinea-Bissau has woven itself into the military, the political elite, the entire power structure. Now, a friend of mine who works in an international development once told me something that stuck with me. In Guinea-Bissau, there is no such thing as clean politician. The question is how dirty and who they are working for. And that brings us to Embaló. Now, when Embaló came to power in 2020, he promised to clean things up. He talked about fighting corruption, strengthening institutions, bringing Guinea-Bissau into the modern era. But power in Guinea-Bissau works differently. You don't get to be president by fighting the system. You get to be president by making deals with the system. So here is the question you should be asking. If Embaló was part of the system, why would the military suddenly turn on him? And that's where this story gets really interesting, because the answer lies in Dakar, Abuja, and Accra. Now, let's talk about ECOWAS for a second. The Economic Community of West African States. 15 countries formed in 1975 to promote economic integration and regional stability. Now, think of it as West Africa's version of the European Union, except with less money and more military interventions. Now, for decades, ECOWAS had one really important function. When one country had a military takeover, ECOWAS will step in, impose sanctions, threaten military intervention, and eventually negotiate some kind of transition back to civilian rule. It wasn't perfect, but it worked most of the time. And then the Sahel happened. Between 2020 and 2023, we saw successful military takeovers in Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Niger. 4 countries, 7 military takeover attempts, if you count the military takeover follow-ups. And ECOWAS, they did what they always do: sanctions, condemnations, threats of intervention. Except this time, nobody cared. Mali told ECOWAS to back off. Burkina Faso did the same. Niger literally threatened to fight back if ECOWAS sends troops. And all 3 countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, formed their own alliance. They called it the Alliance of the Sahel States. They basically said, "We don't recognize your authority anymore." And ECOWAS blinked. Now, here is why Guinea Bissau matters. If you are sitting in Abuja or Accra or Dakar, you are watching your regional organization fall apart, especially in a country that's already this unstable, because every successful military takeover sends a signal, tells other militaries, hey, you can do this too, and no one's going to stop you. So when Guinea Bissau's military made their move on November 25th, ECOWAS saw the entire regional order collapsing. And here is the part that should make you pause. The military in Guinea Bissau isn't stupid. They have seen what happened in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. They know ECOWAS is weakened, and they know the international community is distracted. So why did they coach their military takeover in language about dialogue and constitutional order? So why all the diplomatic niceties? Because they are playing a different game. And to understand what that game is, we need to talk about who's really pulling the strings. Now, here is something most people don't know about Guinea Bissau's economy. The formal economy runs primarily on 3 pillars. Foreign aid makes up a substantial portion of government's revenue. Cashew exports. Guinea Bissau is one of the world's top 10 cashew producers, and those nuts feed global supply chains. And then there is the informal economy, which includes everything from small-scale trade to, well, the cook in routes we talked about earlier. Now, according to the World Bank, Guinea Bissau's GDP 2024 was around $1.9 billion. Now, that figure tells you something about leverage. In a small economy like this, foreign investments becomes transformative. A $50 million infrastructure deal can reshape entire sectors. A $100 million port project can change the entire country's strategic position overnight. Which brings us to the players who understand this better than anyone: China, Portugal, France, and increasingly private interests that don't show up on any diplomatic roster. Now, let's talk about China for a second, and I want us to be really clear here. We are looking at how international relations actually work. China has been systematically investing across West Africa for the last 2 decades. Infrastructure, ports, fishing rights, resource extraction. Now, that's part of a broader strategy to secure trade routes, access to resources, and political influence. Guinea-Bissau is part of that picture. In 2022, China signed a $140 million agreement to modernize Guinea-Bissau's fishing sector and port infrastructure. Now, think about what that means in practice. When you control port infrastructure, you control trade flows. When you control fishing rights, you control access to maritime resources. And when you become the primary source of infrastructure investments, you gain significant political interest. And here is where it gets interesting. Embaló has been walking a tightrope, taking Chinese investments while trying to maintain relationships with Portugal, Guinea Bissau's former colonial power, and France, which still considers West Africa as part of its sphere of influence. That balancing act worked until it stopped working. Now, I don't have access to classified intelligence. I can't tell you what conversations happened behind closed doors in weeks before this military takeover, but I can tell you what the pattern looks like. When a military stages a takeover, they need three things: weapons, money, and political cover. For the weapons, well, the military in Guinea-Bissau already has that. Mostly old Soviet-era equipment, but functional anyway. For the money, that's harder to trace, but military takeovers don't happen spontaneously. Somebody funded this. And for political cover, that's the really interesting part, because the language in that November 25th communique, inclusive dialogue, national reconciliation, constitutional order, that's not the language of Turks. That's the language of people who have been coached, which raises the question, coached by whom? Look, here is what we know for sure. In the weeks before the military takeover, there were reports of unusual military movements around Bissau. Embaló had been making statements about wanting to extend his presidential term beyond constitutional limits. And there were growing tensions between Embaló and the National Assembly, which is dominated by opposition parties. Now, any one of those things would have triggered a military takeover, but all three of them put together, that's a powder keg. So here is my read. I think this military takeover was planned, coordinated, and backed by actors who saw an opportunity, whether those actors are domestic political rivals, foreign powers, or elements within the military itself. That's the question everyone is trying to answer now. And that uncertainty, that's what has ECOWAS panicking. Alright, let's zoom out for a second, because Guinea-Bissau represents something much more bigger. We are watching the shape of West Africa's future being determined in real time. Now, there is an old Wolof proverb: when the tree falls, the monkeys scatter. Right now, the tree is ECOWAS, and everyone is watching to see where the monkeys go. Now, here is the reality. West Africa is at a crossroads. You have the Sahel states pulling away from ECOWAS, forming their own bloc. You have coastal states trying to maintain the old order. You have external powers, Russia, China, France, the US, all jockeying for interest. And you have the populations of these countries who are tired of military takeovers, tired of instability, tired of being pawns in other people's games. But here is what gives me hope. Every time a military takeover happens, there is a conversation that follows. People ask, why does this keep happening? What are we doing wrong? How do we build institutions that actually work? Now, those aren't easy questions, but they are the right questions, because here is what's peculiar about military takeovers. They happen in places where the social contract has broken down, where people don't trust their leaders, where the military sees itself as the only institution that works. Guinea-Bissau checks every one of those boxes. So if you are ECOWAS and you are watching this unfold, what do? You can impose sanctions, you can threaten intervention, you can issue strongly worded condemnation. But we have seen how well that worked in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. So the real question is whether ECOWAS will do the hard work, the work of actually helping countries build functioning institutions, the work of addressing economic challenges that make military rule look attractive, the work of creating a West Africa where military takeovers aren't the only mechanism for political change. Because if you don't, Guinea Bissau won't be the last, it will be the next one. Now, I don't want to end this on a purely pessimistic note, because there are examples, recent examples, of countries that broke the cycle. Look at Ghana: multiple peaceful transitions of power, competitive elections, functioning democratic institutions. Not perfect, no democracy is, but it works. Look at Senegal. Despite recent political tensions, they have maintained constitutional order and avoided military intervention. Now, these countries got there through years of institutional building, civil society engagements, and political compromise. And here is what that tells us: the military takeover in Guinea Bissau could have been prevented. The breakdown of ECOWAS can be reversed. The fragmentation of West Africa can be stopped. But it requires choices, hard choices by leaders, by institutions, by citizens. You know, when I started researching this story, I thought it would be pretty straightforward. Military takeover, regional response, geopolitical implications. But the more I dug into it, I realized we are really watching a story about institutions versus personalities. Whether West Africa builds systems that outlast, or whether we keep cycling through the same patterns of strongmen, military takeovers, and instability. And that's a question that matters far beyond Guinea Bissau. So here is what I want you to think about. If you were advising ECOWAS right now, what would you tell them to do? Do they intervene militarily and risk another failed operation like they almost had in Niger? Do they impose sanctions and hope the military blinks? Or do they try something completely different? Negotiate, offer incentives, find a face-saving path back to civilian rule? See, I genuinely don't know the right answer. I'm not sure anyone does. But I do know this: the decisions made in the next few weeks will tell us whether West Africa is heading towards greater integration or deeper fragmentation, whether institutions matter or whether power still grows out of the barrel of a gun. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you think happens next. And if this kind of analysis is valuable to you, you know what to do.